Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this event on the Australian elections. Australia held elections last Saturday. Despite all the predictions and the polls, the very long-held expectations that Labor would win back government, it was a stunner, and it's now being called the Morrison Miracle, with the Liberal coalition holding on for a victory. So we thought it would be great to try to unpack the results of the election and what drove the results and what the implications are for Australia, for Australian politics and policies, for the alliance with the United States, and for Australia's foreign policy decisions over the next several years. We do know that two key issues in the election were the two C's, or three C's, depending on how you count it: climate change, which is two C's, and China. So we want to get into some of that as well. I have a really terrific panel with two Australians and two Americans, but with deep ties to Australia and the U.S.-Australia relationship. Let me introduce them first, and then we'll hear from them and their take on the elections, and I'll ask them some questions, and we'll open it up for discussion. But first, to my right, I have Jacob Greber, who is the U.S. correspondent for the Australian Financial Review. Jacob covers a wide range of topics, including American politics, economic and business, from the AFR's Washington Bureau, and he previously served as the Australian Financial Review's economics correspondent based in Canberra. To my left, I have our other Australian participant, Patrick Buchan, who is the director of the U.S. Alliances Project and fellow of Indo-Pacific Security here at CSIS. And prior to joining us here at CSIS, he served over 3 years as Australia's representative on the staff of the Office of the Secretary of Defense in Policy in the Pentagon in Washington, where he was responsible for alliance strategy in the Indo-Pacific, or as we called it back in those days, the Asia-Pacific. But he's held several positions in both the Defense Department and the Department of the Prime Minister and Cabinet back in Canberra. To his left, we have Alan Tidwell. Professor Tidwell is the director of the Center for Australian, New Zealand, and Pacific Studies, located in the Edmund A. Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. Prior to that, he held a number of positions, including an officer at the United States Institute for Peace, and he was at Macquarie University and Sydney University in Australia, including directing the Australian Centre for American Studies at Sydney University in the 1990s. And then over to my right, we have Zack Cooper, who is a fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, where he studies U.S. defense strategy in Asia and U.S. alliance and partnerships in Asia, and issues related to Chinese economic statecraft and coercion. Prior to crossing the street, moving down the street to AEI, Zack was here with our CSIS Asia family, where he was senior fellow for Asian security. And he also has held positions at the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments, and has held positions in the NSC and Department of Defense. So with that, let me open up with Jacob. Can you tell us, what the hell happened?
What the hell happened? Yeah, I think we're all trying to figure that one out. And the first thing I'm quite impressed by is the interest in it here in Washington, straight off the bat. I didn't think we really drew much attention to what we get up to down there, even though it is as wild sometimes as other places. So my first observation is I'm actually quite proud of Australia for giving Brexit and the various sort of turmoil that you have here in America a run for its money. I think we're holding our own in the unexpected stakes, which is good. It's definitely the biggest upset easily in my working life, certainly since '93. It could even be the biggest upset ever if you go back further through Federation. We didn't have polling in the early days like we do now, so there probably wasn't an expectation to be shattered the way it was last weekend back in those days. So looking at it, I was in Canberra for most of the last 10 years on and off, and it's been fun to watch an Australian election from Washington. I've seen some truly terrible takes on what the lesson of that election is in Australia. A lot of people have sort of grabbed the idea that Scott Morrison is some sort of Donald Trump character, some sort of populist who has duped an electorate. And I think that's a really misguided way of looking at what happened down under this time round. Morrison's really has very little in common with Donald Trump. He's a traditional conservative. He ran a very determined campaign against the odds and against someone who was just simply expected to win because the Liberal Party and the coalition in particular was in such turmoil. Morrison turned that disadvantage into incredibly a pitch for stability and a pitch for no change, which really is the opposite of what Donald Trump did. So that's sort of the most obvious thing. I'm sure we'll get into that. The issue of polling and why, quote unquote, everyone got it wrong, I've got some strong views on that. I think that's also been overstated. I think a lot of people maybe don't read polls the way they should read them. They become too declarative about what they mean, and it feeds on itself, and it creates a sort of sense of inevitability about an election which has been exposed. So what the hell happened? A big election that one side portrayed as, you know, an existential moment on things like climate change and on things like tax. That was the Labor Party. They said the time had to be, you know, the time was right to confront those difficult issues. Climate change has claimed now 6 leaders in Australian political life in the last 10 years. It's a savage topic. The system's struggling to deal with it, and it's churning through leaders at a great rate of knots. The other side ran a very small target campaign. They didn't put a lot of policies out there. People knew what they stood for. Incredibly, Scott Morrison was able to be the stability candidate, which, if you know anything about the last few years, is quite an achievement. But he pulled it off. Labor didn't have much of a narrative in the areas that mattered about things like how will Australia grow the economic pie. The narrative was much more, or the perception was much more, that what they were about was how to re-divide the pie and redistribute the pie. And that left them very vulnerable to Morrison, who's a very good campaigner, it turns out, confounding a lot of people's expectations on that, including, I'll admit myself, I thought in August of last year when Malcolm Turnbull was rolled that they had no chance, and it shows you everything's possible.
Great, thank you very much. Pat, let me turn to you. What is your take, and what, in a few short words, what do you think this means for some big policy issues, including some foreign policy challenges?
So the first thing is, I now know why Greber wanted to go first, because he just took all the points that we talked about before. I might just start on the domestic side, and then we'll have a chat about the foreign and defence strategic side of the argument. The first point, I think Jacob's 100% spot on. Some of the New York Times and some of the US press have naturally gravitated towards, we're in America, so every story always has to have an American angle, that, this is Australia's Trump Brexit moment. And again, I think Jacob's spot on. It's certainly not. This was an Australian electorate who in the last 10 or 15 years have gone not only through profound political change, everyone's sick to death, whether you're a civil servant in Canberra or you're running a ranch in outback Western Australia, everyone has just had enough of this constant rolling of leaders, turmoil, change, and that is not, by the way, only at the federal level, it's at the state level. It took me to age 31 before I got to when I was still on my 4th Prime Minister. In the last 10 years, my son is 10, this is his 6th Prime Minister. Now that sort of says a broader issue in the electorate. The volatility in the electorate's a really interesting thing. A guy called Campbell Newman up in Queensland won the largest landslide in Australian political history. I mean, it was a wipeout for the Labor Party, and he lost the next election 4 years later. So there's a deeper issue in the Australian electorate, which we see across the Western world, of this volatility in the electorate. But this time, I believe that it was not just about stability. I think there was a shy Tory effect going on. Many Australians that I speak to, including sort of, classic middle Australia, for where I come from, people had enough of this feeling of the freedom of speech argument. And also I think what this points to is, social media has become a tin can that rattles, makes a lot of noise, and the outcomes are actually not what we thought they were. I think things like Facebook and targeting, political campaigns targeting Facebook, that's a different story, but those who are screaming the loudest on social media, particularly on things like Twitter and WeChat and all these other things, it's shown that in the end it actually is not going to sway a lot except those who scream the loudest. So stability was the thing that Morrison understood, and stability was the thing he played for. I also believe that that Labor went, there's a classic maxim in Australian politics is governments lose elections, oppositions don't win them, right? As we should do in a think tank, I sort of went through in depth on both party platforms. And if you looked at the Liberal Party platform, the Liberal National Party platform, it was a very brief 11 or 12 page document, half a dozen dot points under a vision statement on national security, on social security, on taxation policy. If you looked at the Labor Party platform, it was an enormous document with a level of specificity, there's a Kevin Rudd word for you, that was just so much detail. Now, the only people who are going to read that are people like us in think tanks. I don't think, the average mum and dad in the suburbs washing the dishes, looking out the window, talking about the mortgage at night are going to worry about, Labor's commitment to reintroduce a national security advisor. So it was a lot of detail. The big picture strategy that Labor pushed didn't resonate with the electorate, but I think Jacob is spot on. I know Alan and Zack are going to have views on this, but this was not an election about change, it was an election about we've had enough of change.
Thank you. Let me turn to you, Alan, to get the American academic perspective of what happened and what this means.
Sure. Just to build on the previous two comments, what I find really interesting about this election, while the newspapers have been replete with commentary about this was, the coalition winning the unwinnable election, right? And it's a great headline. But what it hides is a shift in the voting patterns in Australia that's worthy of some comment. 25% of the voting public voted for one of the minor parties. The increase in minor party voting is been occurring now for a couple of years. We saw a swing this last election to One Nation and to Palmer's United Australia Party. It was a small swing, but a swing nonetheless. And I think it just underscores the point that this fractionating of the Australian polity is continuing apace. This is not just a one-off event. And the other comment I would make is that some of the American commentary has been that this, is a Trump election. And again, I would agree with my colleagues that that's the wrong read. What is correct, though, is to say that overwhelmingly, working class people voted with the coalition. People without tertiary education were more broadly represented as coalition voters. And so it has an echo of Reagan 1980. It has an echo of Howard 1996. It has an echo of Thatcher 1979, which in each one of those elections, a more conservative candidate was able to carve off a segment of traditionally leftward voting public. And I think that's a really interesting dynamic in this election. What does it all mean? Well, it would be really interesting to see how this Morrison government rolls out. And one of the things I would just note is that, of course, we've not seen a Morrison government because, of course, while he was prime minister, he hit the ground running in election mode. He never really had an opportunity to be prime minister on his own. And so it's going to be really interesting to see how that rolls out and sort of what the manifestations of his leadership are. I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Let me turn to Zack. I'm wondering what you think this means in terms of the alliance, the U.S.-Australia alliance, but also specifically, the Liberal government under Turnbull and now Morrison, they've taken a very hard line on China, at least from Beijing's perspective, it's been a hard line. There was the anti-interference legislation. One of the last things that Malcolm Turnbull did before he was rolled is he passed the legislation or made the regulations so that Chinese companies, Huawei, ZTE, could not participate in the building of the 5G network in Australia. Beijing has been very unhappy about that and has sort of put Canberra in a diplomatic freeze, and I'm sure they were looking forward to a reset with a new Liberal government. So what do you think this means in terms of Canberra's policy towards Beijing?
I think that's exactly right. The Chinese definitely planned, I think, to keep the coalition government in the freezer, hoping that a Labor government was going to come in. And I think the Labor government would have actually adopted some fairly tough policies, but probably not ones that would look quite the way the Turnbull approach had looked. So I think the Chinese are probably as surprised as the rest of us. I think as an American overall, many of us have gone to Australia for the last few years and heard complaints from Australian friends about how Americans didn't give them good advice on what was going to come out of the election in Washington in 2016. So I think there's a little bit of retribution here for some of us Americans who were told that Labor was going to win and win easily. But I think for the Chinese, it's got to be another surprise, right? I think they expected Hillary Clinton to win here in 2016. They expected a Labor government to win in Australia this year. And so it does put them in a difficult spot if you're in Beijing trying to figure out how do you deal with this new government. Do you punish them for the policies that the coalition adopted over the last few years, or do you try and slowly take Australia out of the freezer and approach the Morrison government as a new government and basically wave off the last 9 months or so? The other thing I'd say is I think we do see some similarities, not between what the electorate was thinking in the United States and in Australia, but in the debate that's happening now in Australia, which is to say that after Donald Trump won here in 2016, there was a lot of talk looking back at the election, but not much clarity on what a Trump administration was actually going to do. And I think that's the same situation we find ourselves in with the Morrison government. And furthermore, I think Labor is now in a very tricky spot, and one that reminds me a lot of what the Democrats have been going through here the last 2 years. You have three instincts in these periods after a shock election loss, right? The first is, I think, to blame the opposition, right? So calls, I was watching the ABC stream, and if you listen to what some of the Labor politicians were saying, they were saying, well, it's because the people of Australia were too aligned in some cases with one nation, right? The coalition relied on racism to win the election. And then, you start digging into the numbers, you see, well, there's some truth to that, but it's a broader story, right? And then you start blaming the candidate. And you say, well, no one wanted Shorten. He just wasn't the right person to spread the message that we were looking for. I think you've heard a lot of this in the US with people blaming Hillary Clinton for the 2016 loss. And then I think finally you come to the last conclusion, which is where we started off, which is that it was really about Labor's message, right? Is that the support for the taxation policies, the climate policies just wasn't there in the way that people expected. And I think as a result, you find in Australia now both parties kind of searching for what they're about. I think Labor searching because they thought they knew, and now they don't. And I think now you're going to find the coalition searching because, frankly, they hadn't really tried to figure it out before the election because they weren't that convinced that they were going to win.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Jacob, let me follow up with you on this in this vein. So Scott Morrison, we're now told he's going to have 3 years as Prime Minister, which seems like an astoundingly long time in Australian politics these days. So he seems pretty secure in his job.
Don't say anything, sir.
Well, so that's one question: is how certain is that? Because it is being portrayed as a pretty near certainty. Yeah. But yet, as has been mentioned, the Liberal coalition did not win more votes than previous elections. They still have a very thin majority. It's just that the rise of these other parties seem to be taking away votes from both the Liberals and Labor. So it's not like he has he won a stunning electoral victory, but it's not as if he has a huge mandate in terms of overwhelming numbers of the Australian public. So what do you think he will try to accomplish over the next 3 years if he has that? Is it just more of the same, stability, stay the course? And what does that look like?
I think that's exactly what they're going to deliver, because that's actually what people want. He's got a small majority. I think it'll end up 77 seats. You need 76, then you lose a speaker, so 77, maybe 78. I think there's one more seat to go. In the upper house, he has to deal with about 6 crossbenchers. If Labor and the Greens combine to oppose whatever he wants, he has to do a deal with, I think it'll be 4 of those 6 crossbenchers. They're most of them are moderates. There's one wild card from Tasmania. and the well-informed will know who I'm talking about. And then there's, you know, so that's sort of the reality of what he confronts. He's told Australia he wants to do more of the same. He's got his tax agenda to get through. People will be very much waiting for that. He's got an ongoing difficult thing to deal with climate change, because business wants something that they can put certainty around. He's certainly not going to do anything radical on that front. In terms of foreign policy, I think Zack's right. It'll be very much more of the same. That's not something people generally vote on in Australia. Although I would make the caveat that Australia has a very large Australian Chinese community, and I think they supported Turnbull and Morrison in the hard line on China. They're in Australia for a reason, quite a lot of them. So that's, I think he's not going to be ashamed of not having, quote unquote, a big mandate to do something big. That's exactly what Labor was trying to do. You know, I think part of the problem with all of this is, from a journalist's point of view, you say, well, you know, it's terrible Labor had a big agenda and they got shot down. One of the reasons they did that 2 or 3 years ago, they really felt they didn't want to just win government because the other side was chaotic and then not be able to do anything with it. So they rolled the dice. It failed. You know, people weren't up for that. So Morrison's path's quite clear. But then the final observation on all of this is, I think Morrison will be a student of history, in '93 in particular, which led to a sort of hubris in the Labor Party that backfired horribly. And it goes to Pat's point about how things are volatile. If the coalition now oversteps its whatever mandate it's got, that'll set it up for a backlash. And I think he'll be very conscious of that. History always shows unexpected elections of this sort of nature tend to reverse quite dramatically.
04 for Howard, taking both houses, and then losing in 07.
Yeah.
Pat, what do you think the Morrison government is going to look like in terms of, you know, what are the implications for the alliance with the United States? Are we just on smooth sailing? Are there any issues or kind of shoals up ahead that we need to watch out for?
Yeah, I mean, you know, it's an interesting question. I think that you're not going to see any radical deviation in the settings they've got now. I don't think you would have seen that with Labor. You know, just if we look back in history, some of the tensions in the alliance, you know, Whitlam, Nixon in '72, the Christmas bombing. I know, Jacob, you wrote about this in a piece not long ago. You know, that kind of put a tension on the relationship. 83, 86, the MX missile crisis. I think it was 85. When the Hawke government came in, we had that issue in the alliance. You know, the alliance went through in the 90s a kind of, you know, I don't think it was its greatest moment, and that was just a reflection of the international environment. The reality is, obviously, as the weight of history has shifted to the region, you know, the United States obviously looks to countries like Japan and Australia for stability. I don't think Morrison, if you went through the party platform, you know, the only country specifically mentioned, apart from commitments to, you know, multilateralism and, you know, and the region, the only country specifically mentioned in the Liberal Party platform was the United States. You know, we are going to see a new defence minister. I think that the good money's on Senator Linda Reynolds from Western Australia, who's an Army Reserve brigadier. She came into the Parliament in 2014, so not a long time in Canberra, but clearly, given her background, a very credentialed person. I think Senator Payne will remain as the Foreign Minister. So the last thing, if Mr Morrison's message was stability, and by the way, he is a very powerful Prime Minister now with his own party, delivering this unwinnable election. You know, he can go about selecting his cabinet, and I would imagine that if the message was "I'm stability," why would he go radically shifting that around? There's just no political capital in that. Maybe in 12 or 18 months, he may seek to reshuffle things around as he prepares for 3 years from now, but I don't think at this stage. You know, I think the other issue is, you know, politically, obviously in the last few years, you know, the Senate's looked like something out of the bar scene from Star Wars. I mean, it's just been a shambles for them. And I think, you know, it's been this vicious cycle, hasn't it? You've had the Australian people becoming disenchanted with, you know, the two sides of politics. So how do you send a message? Well, you vote for a minor party. The minor party gets in there, the major parties have to dilute legislation in the Senate, which makes people more disenchanted that policies aren't getting through. So it's kind of in many ways a self-inflicted wound. Now, what I will say, and give absolute credit to both sides of the major parties here, you know, if I was to have one wish, it would be electoral reform in the Senate. Electoral reform in the Senate. And both parties have worked to do that. Obviously, it's in their own interest, but I think it's in the national interest to get rid of these minor parties, who, by the way, in some cases receive literally 100 votes. 100 votes and you can become a senator. That is not right. It's not representative of democracy, and it creates these single issue parties. And I don't want to single any out, but you know, I'm not quite sure how the Australian Motorist Party is, you know, what their macroeconomic strategies are going to be. And they're just one in many of these folks. So I think that is a good thing that Australia's sort of headed down this path of stability, not only at the lower house but also in the Senate. Back to the foreign policy agenda, I think that he will, Mr. Morrison, it'll be interesting to see where he goes for his first trip. Traditionally, you know, it's become Jakarta, and that's a very good thing. But I'd also, if I was in the Prime Minister's office and Prime Minister happened to ask my opinion, I would say certainly Jakarta, but I think that we'd also should put a swing through, you know, something like Port Moresby, through our immediate region. Obviously, we've seen that's become a focus for the government, as it should be. For the United States, we know we had the leaders of Micronesia, the Marshall Islands and Palau in town this week, and also our friends in New Zealand have done the same thing. So a Pacific reset, Pacific step up should see the Prime Minister, in my view, make a swing through Port Moresby or through our friends in Fiji very quickly, just to send that message to the region that Australia is back in the South Pacific game.
Great. Alan, as a student of Australian politics, you started with some remarks about the parties fracturing, but can you dive into that a little bit more? I mean, it seems that the United States and Australia share this in common, and with other countries as well, that, you know, the party system in some ways is breaking down in terms of allegiance, affiliation with parties, more willingness to think of oneself as an independent voter, and in Australia's case, vote for single issue or third parties. Are we looking at a potential real realignment of Australian politics down the line?
Well, I think Australian politics has been in the process of realigning for quite some time. I mean, if you look at the role of labor unions and their hold on power in the Labor Party itself, I mean, it's on the decline. If you look at unionism in Australia, I think it's now at around 14%. When I moved to Australia in 1992, I think it was around 40%. I mean, that is a precipitous fall. And so I think that one, the working class base of labor is in tremendous transition. One of the interesting things is we did some research at Macquarie University years ago when First Nation first came along in 1996, looking at sort of who were One Nation voters in New South Wales. And much to our surprise, you know who they were. They were Labor voters. I mean, that was stunning. That was really unexpected. So the process of fractioning has been going at a pace. Look, most Australian voters don't identify themselves as being, you know, strictly party aligned. They vote for the representative who they trust, who they think is going to do the best job. But you know, I think that Australia is echoing this realignment process. What it looks like in a few years' time, I don't know. But you know, today, if you were to describe the Labor Party, for instance, you would have to say it's an urban party. By and large, it's a party of people with tertiary education with very, in American terms, very liberal points of view. And I think in the coalition, you would say that we are talking about both working class people as well as business owners, small business owners, as being well represented. So yeah, there is that transition.
Let me turn, Zack, to you. Going back to the foreign policy, some of the key foreign policy issues, and specifically relations between Australia and China, you know, from Canberra's perspective, do you think that Morrison and his government are going to take this as a referendum on their relatively tough stance with China and sort of double down on that, even if Beijing continues to freeze them out and find various levers that they try to pull to sort of punish them? Or do you think that they will attempt to recalibrate slightly soften, perhaps more in tone than substance, but look for their own sort of diplomatic reset. And then from Beijing's perspective, what would you predict that they would do?
That's a tough question, and I don't think we know the answer yet. I think we have to expect that on Beijing's side, you're going to see some effort to rekindle a relationship. It is just not feasible for the Chinese to keep Australia in the freezer forever.
Yeah.
And I think the plan had been to keep the coalition in the freezer until they lost an election, and I don't think they want to wait another 3 years. So I think you may see some tougher policies out of the United States that may not be echoed in Australia if Australia is trying to reach out in a more positive way. And that puts the Morrison government in a little bit of a tough spot. There's a lot of frustration here in Washington right now with the divide that's growing between some of the United States' allies and Washington's own policies on China. If you look at what's been going on in London with the 5G debate, if you look at New Zealand signing on to the Belt and Road, these are some cracks in some pretty critical Five Eyes nations. And Australia has been really the toughest out of the Five Eyes alongside the United States on China. And so I think there will be some concern in the administration that you might see a different approach out of a Morrison government, not entirely different. And there was concern about an incoming Labor government coming in with a different approach, right? It's part, I think, of why Bill Shorten and Penny Wong and Richard Marles had gone to such efforts to come to Washington and to reassure folks in the national security community that they were going to take roughly similar policies on China with some different tinges maybe than the coalition had. So I do think you have to expect that there's going to be some effort by the Chinese to try and re-engage with Canberra, to try and reset the relationship onto slightly stronger footing. I don't have any idea what kind of response Canberra is going to make, but I think the signs we've seen recently have been that there are a lot of people in the Australian government who want to be fairly tough on this issue and who are deeply concerned. I think one of the really interesting questions, and this came up in a couple of the other comments, is how does this play in the Pacific, right?
Yeah.
Labor had been very clear that they were going to make a real appeal to the Pacific, follow on some of what the coalition had done. I think one of the challenges for Australia, and it's the same challenge the United States has, is what's one of the top issues in the Pacific? Climate change. So how do you go to Pacific Islands and convince them that this is not all about geopolitics, it's not all about US-China or Australia-China, but you really care about what's going on in the Pacific Islands without talking a little bit about climate change?
Yeah.
And can a leader like Trump or like Morrison actually do that effectively? I don't know, that's a tough question.
Well, let me just follow up with Jacob on this question about climate change. And you've touched on it a couple times already, but what could we expect out of a Morrison government? Are there some steps that it could take on climate change beyond where the Liberals have been so far? Or are they, as Zack pointed out, are they just sort of stuck in this position where they have very little to offer the Pacific, where they're calling it one of their biggest priority areas?
I think that's right. I don't think there's a lot of room for them to move, and they won't want to go there. It's just political death, that whole topic. So they'll try and do whatever they can, whatever they have to do, whatever business wants them to do, up to a point. They're not going to make a big statement on it. To go back a little bit on the question about whether Morrison will maintain the hard line on China, from the which is of interest here in America, obviously, because as Zack pointed out, Huawei the first decision was by the Australian government. The test of that and the trigger point for that will be the iron ore price. Keep an eye on the iron ore price. It's cushioning a lot of this for the Australian economy at the moment. It's above $100. It's giving the government all sorts of revenue that it wasn't expecting. It's able to say it's going to deliver a balanced budget, and it's the thing that is disguising some of the inherent weakness in the Australian economy. Now, if China wants to play hardball, there are some things it can do to really undermine that.
Right.
On education, on tourism, there was even a report this morning that the restrictions on coal imports into China are staying put for now. Bloomberg had a report on it, or might have been Reuters. So that's going to be the test of the resolve. And so, watch the iron ore price.
And but how would that play? So, hypothetically, if China were to play hardball and employ some of these economic coercion tactics, then I would think it would be a really tough position for the Morrison government to be in, because on the one hand, you would certainly have elements of the business community that would say, hey, we've got to deal with China, we can't live with this. But on the other hand, it would certainly be seen as quite apparent caving into Beijing. So, from a broad kind of, domestic political perspective, how do you think that would play?
Well, I don't think they'd cave in on any, I think the problem with China's approach is if it makes it antagonistic on that front, that'll just reinforce the resolve in Canberra, not to back down.
Right.
But it will depend on what state the economy's in. I mean, it's the same question here. Can Trump maintain the tariff conflict when you've got growth at 2% suddenly and unemployment goes up, and the markets fall?
Right.
That'll be the test of it. And sure, China has its own issue as well. But the idea that a Morrison government would just sit by and let China kind of do tough things to it, that wouldn't fly either.
And Pat, we haven't really talked that much about the alliance. I guess it's, obviously it's probably in pretty good shape with this election. But can you say anything about the Trump-Morrison personal connection and any observations you do have about the alliance?
I think Donald Trump and Mr. Morrison, as personalities and personas, as probably two different people as you can get. I don't think there's any great breaking story in that one. However, what Australia has done well and Japan has done well, I think Mr. Abe has been the kind of model for all this, has not to respond with Mr. Trump's bombastic style in response. We've seen some of the European leaders and they've engaged in that, and I just don't think that's smart politically, and you're not going to win a Twitter war of words with Donald Trump. It just doesn't work that way. So the Europeans, I think, by and large, have played it very badly, very badly. Mr. Abe has played it very well. Mr. Morrison's personality style, I think, is very much along the Abe line. Where you agree or disagree, you do it publicly, you do it privately, you do it through the correct channels, and you don't run around doing megaphone diplomacy. So I actually think, when you think around the world, how many political leaders, particularly of close US allies, does Donald Trump have a great personal rapport with? And I don't think there's many. Abe is one of them. I think this represents an opportunity for Australia to really influence through a guy like Mr. Morrison. And I think the way to do that would be through the private discussions with Mr. Trump, where you disagree. You don't do it in public, you do it privately. Things like, if you look at where the main differences perhaps in the alliance are right now, it's on the free trade issue. Right? The Liberal Party are called the Liberal Party when they were founded in 1944, not only because they were committed to classical liberalism, but liberal free trade. Right? That's the core of the party, small enterprise, free trade. Obviously, in this administration, and Mrs. Clinton, by the way, in 2016 went down this path as well. Politically, the United States had to put itself in this position. But if we talk about Indo-Pacific strategy, things like countering BRI, I don't think there's anyone in this room who believes that China's BRI is an economic model, right? Yeah, it is in part, but we all know what it is. It is part of a grander strategy for influence. That's what great powers do. And the old adage, if you give a great power an inch, it'll take a mile, because that's how you become a great power. That's reality. I think it is in everyone's interest, and including the United States strategically, for the United States to join the TPP, the CTPP. And in my opinion, this represents a golden opportunity quietly for Australia to expand to the United States through to the President what this grander strategic picture is and how it will benefit the United States and the region for the United States to sign on to the TPP. Whether that happens or not in this term, I doubt it, but I think I'm on the record saying this before. I believe whoever becomes the next president, whether it's a Democrat or whether it's Mr. Trump, I believe the United States will sometime in the next term, between 2020 and 2024, the United States will join the TPP. I believe that to be the case, and I think Mr. Morrison has a golden opportunity to explain to the United States strategically why it's in its interest to do so. But the one issue in the alliance does remain the trade issue. That's just a fact.
I hope you're right on CP2, by the way, but we'll have to see. Okay, I see some hands up already. So since we are running, we have about 10 minutes for questions. Let's open it up, and I'll start with Stanley. If you just wait for the microphone and introduce yourself.
Stanley Roth, unaffiliated. 3 quick comments and a quick question. One, I think the panel understated the enduring nature of the alliance. I had the misfortune in my corporate role to be in Australia numerous times during the administration of George W. Bush. The taxi poll I took didn't find anyone who liked him. The word cowboy came up all the time. I asked every single driver, did they support the alliance? They said yes. I think you can make the case the alliance will endure no matter who's in office in Australia. I can't say the same for the US side. Second, I don't think that China is likely to be tough on iron ore. Obviously can't predict the future, but at a time of a trade war with the US, the last thing they need is multiple hurt parties, particularly in the region.
That's a good point.
I think that one is unlikely. Well, let me just skip to the question.
Can I respond to that one? Sorry, yeah. On the
and my
iron ore?
question really is, could you talk in more detail about the impact, of the trade war between China and Australia on the US thus far or in the future?
On Australia, the impact on Australia, yeah. Why don't you say something about the iron ore, and then also take that question, and then we can turn to others.
It's not that China would do something to make iron ore fall. Iron ore is your indicator about how the global economy is going, and it happens to be the most important one for Australia. That was the point I was making. Yeah.
Go ahead.
Could I jump in on the alliance question?
Sure.
So I think you're absolutely right that the U.S.-Australia alliance is on solid ground. I think it was going to be on solid ground regardless of who won the election.
Yeah.
I do think, though, that this puts off some difficult discussions in the alliance that I think would have been helpful. I think there was some concern here about some of the discussions that Labor would have wanted to have about how we talk about human rights issues and shared values that we have, about trade. I think those get put off now, right? There's very little reason for the Morrison government to try and address these in a direct way with the Trump administration, in part because they're probably not going to get very far. So it probably is good for the embassy across the street. They will get a bit more sleep than they might have otherwise. But I think in the long term, there are some underlying issues in the US-Australia relationship that have been unaddressed for quite some time. Many of them are about China, and many of them are tough to deal with, in part because we don't have entirely the same interests, and in part because our publics don't share all of the same views as the governments. So for example, if you ask Americans what are their top concerns about China, it's not about security issues, it's not about Taiwan, Japan disputes, it's all economic, right? And so I think there are some tensions between Washington and the public here, and I think those same tensions exist in Australia between Canberra and the general public on China policy that have gone unaddressed. And I think, frankly, the Labor government would have had to address some of these in a more forthright manner. Now I think you can kind of let them go for at least a couple of years. Maybe they go unaddressed, but my view is in the long term, we're going to have to address these issues. We're going to have to do it directly. And if you look at any other major US alliance relationship, whether it's US-Japan, US-Korea, US-NATO, we talk about differences in the alliance. We just don't do that much in the US-Australia alliance. And I think eventually we're going to have to.
Yeah, I agree with that point. Jacob, would you like to take a stab at Stanley's question about how the US-China trade war has or will impact the Australian economy?
Gee, I wish we had more soybeans. We would have done all right. Would have been a real opportunity for Australia. How does the trade war affect Australia? Everyone's still trying to work that out, and the question is how far does it go? How extreme does it become? There's a sense, I think, just even today, but I think it really hit 10 days ago, that the protagonists are kind of losing control of the thing. It's going beyond what they can manage, and now it sort of heads into the realm of unpredictable outcomes. That's a real worry for a trading nation like Australia, which depends on a healthy global economy. We want China to be doing well. We want America to be doing well. we can probably survive if only one of them's doing well, but it gets a lot harder. So that, I mean, it's a straightforward view. That's the idea of tariffs. Yeah, it's just it doesn't sit well from a national interest point of view for an Australian. The idea that you're taxing your consumers twice in the case of the money that's now going to be given to soy farmers, or has been, is, we fought those battles in the 80s and the 70s, and it took 20 years to get to that point. The idea that we re-prosecute that is pretty worrisome.
Okay. Other questions? Yes? Back here? Yes. Could you wait for the microphone and please introduce yourself?
Hi, Scott Wingo from the University of Pennsylvania. At the very end, you mentioned the Belt and Road and how the United States and Australia could be countering it. What do you think we should do in response to the Belt and Road Initiative?
That was you, I think, I mentioned that.
Yeah, thanks for your question. So one of the interesting things you can look at is, let's cut it down into three or four areas of how you can counter BRI. So one is you can be honest about what your national security officials are telling you. I think one of the problems we've had with the China relationship is there is an immense discord between what officials discuss with one another and what our political leaders tell their constituents, right? We all know that that the well-known issues about China and the interference issues and the problems we've had in the South China Sea, and I think our publics are aware of that. So I think, firstly, you can have an honest conversation about the threats, but opportunities that China can present to us. The first thing you do is you do what the Australians, the Japanese, the New Zealanders and the United States announced in November 2018 before APEC. Joint infrastructure and development funding, targeted infrastructure and development funding, climate change funding for countries in the region where they've consistently identified this is our number one choice. So you don't have, for an infrastructure and development model, a top-down, hi, I'm here from Washington, I'm here to help. That's not going to cut it. It's listening to the region, the nations in the region, particularly in the South Pacific and the Pacific Islands, who feel that for too long they've been ignored because the United States particularly, and Australia, took the region to be strategically benign. So that's the first thing you do. The second thing you do is on a strategic sort of, if you will, military front. And I note that Labor committed to this. Rudd ditched the idea back in 2007, but the Quad is that there's an idea for you that presents a real opportunity to show not only the liberal democracies of the region are willing to stand together to push back, but also within that, it doesn't have to just be something like a strategic military alliance. You can have an infrastructure development model. You can have an education model to that. Always appeal to the horse called self-interest because it'll always be the one trying. And I think an imposed model like the BRI has got, which we clearly know is not in the interests of those countries who sign up in the long term. It's just not. It's like a sugar hit. But in the end, you are going to have to pay for what you signed up to, and two, the immediate benefits and the long-term benefits to your country through in many cases infrastructure that is not up to the standards you can get elsewhere. But also it's things like your own workers don't get the benefit of building the actual infrastructure themselves. So I think that we need to look at, the concept of an Asian NATO is ridiculous, and we all know that that's just, not going to happen. But, these kind of mini-laterals, if you will, are the way to go about it. And not just throwing money at the problem, but targeted development, infrastructure on the ground, but most importantly, that those nations who are the recipient nations, if you will, benefit the most out of it. What is it you want rather than what we want?
Alan, let me ask you about the Pacific, has been mentioned a few times. How has the recent step-up policy, step-up strategy for the Pacific been playing in the Pacific? And some of the initiatives that Pat alluded to where Australia and the United States and others are working together, just some initial steps in this area, but to try to provide some infrastructure, some ICT, that as alternatives perhaps to Chinese finance projects. How is that playing? Is the Pacific receptive to turning their back on Chinese financed projects? Or, you know, do you think we're going to be doing more in this vein?
Well, it's interesting that certainly that both Australia, New Zealand, and now the United States are making a much stronger pitch in the Pacific Islands. I think back to the session that you had here just the other day when Ambassador Amaro was speaking, and I think the kind of the raised eyebrow. We'll see it when we'll believe it when we see it. Right? Yeah. And I think that's very much the view in the Pacific. I was talking with friends just the other day in Fiji after the election and sort of saying, well, what do you think of the results of the election? And there was a palpable sense of disappointment around climate change. Yeah. And so I think that is going to be a weight that Australia is going to have to manage. And that's with the Pacific Island Forum as well as capitals around the Pacific. But I think that there's a welcome of increased investment. I don't know that infrastructure is necessarily what the Pacific Islanders are looking for. I don't know that that's the sole thing that's being looked for. I think there's an awful lot of work to do in the development space. And this is one of the strengths that I think Labor was bringing to the table, was that they were being able to bring not just infrastructure spending, but also the promotion of human capital and social capital, so that they were talking about, if you will, really enhancing the capacity of Pacific Islanders to resolve problems for themselves. So. I think there's an awful lot of work to do. And I think people will be very receptive and happy to work with the Morrison government. But I think an awful lot still needs to be done. Yeah. And one of the comments I would also add is that because Western engagement, Australia, New Zealand, the United States, Japan, Great Britain, France, they've all had episodic engagement with the Pacific. It goes up and down, up and down. And I think that we're really in a moment, as we look in the competition between the United States and China and competition for influence in the Pacific, that one of the things that we really need to have an eye on is having an engagement that isn't just episodic, that isn't the flavor of the month, but persists over time. Yeah. And I would say, Amy, that time frame, you've got to talk about a generation. Yeah. Pacific Islanders want to work with Australia and New Zealand and the United States. Those are the preferred partners. But you have to be there to make it happen. And I think that's key.
Yeah, and obviously it's a huge dilemma for the United States and Australia as well. And having those kinds of institutionalized commitments that are really durable over time is a real challenge. Yeah.
Can I just build on that last point Alan was making, which I think is really important. Where the US and Australia and New Zealand show up, we tend to be the preferred partners, but we're not going to be everywhere. Yeah. We just don't have the resources to match Belt and Road in every country in Central Asia and Eastern Europe and Africa. And so I think we have to accept that China is going to get traction in some places. We've seen this even among the G7 and Italy signing a memorandum of understanding on the Belt and Road. So my view is you've got to accept that China is going to get traction with the Belt and Road. It's just too big for them not to get traction, and it's too attractive to some countries that desperately need investments in infrastructure. Yeah. The question is which countries, and in some ways the Chinese have placed their bets everywhere. Right? There's almost no country in the world that isn't part of the Belt and Road, excepting the United States and maybe Australia. But that is actually a risk for China in that the United States and Australia and New Zealand and others, we get to choose where to make our investments. And because we tend to be the preferred partners, if we choose smartly, we're probably going to be the ones that win out in those cases. But we can't choose everywhere. And so we're going to have to make some hard choices. And I think this comes back to one area where we've seen a big evolution in the alliance in just the last year or so, a real focus, both in Washington and in Canberra, on the Pacific. Yeah. And I think one of the nice things for the alliance is for so long we've been focused on out-of-area operations, dragging Australia into the Middle East. And now the concerns that the United States have are back in Australia's neighborhood. And so actually, for a lot of national security reasons, the alliance is almost easier to deal with now than it's ever been before because we want to be where Australia is.
The alliance is certainly more Asian and Pacific now than it was before, and I think that is a healthy development in the long run. I just have to comment briefly on, I think, when we think about Belt and Road in the Pacific, I think we should just be careful both in terms of the Pacific Islanders seeing it as a black and white issue. There are projects that are welcome and are seen in their long-term interests, and others that they're quite aware are shoddy or come with downside risks. And so they're kind of savvy, managers of China. They've been dealing with China longer than we have. So we should be supporting them with alternatives and any other assistance and showing up, as many people here have said. But I don't think we should assume that the Belt and Road initiatives are unappealing for all countries in all cases. And also, I also think we should be careful to not see everything that China's doing in the Pacific through the lens of the Belt and Road, because, of course, Chinese commercial development in these countries is extremely important, and again comes with downside risks, environmental problems, other problems that the Pacific Islanders are well aware of. So again, we should be helping them manage those relationships. But the Chinese are pouring an investment in commercial activities in a way that traditional partners are not. And we shouldn't be naive to think that by stepping up, by targeting, that we can alleviate that kind of influence and leverage as well. Is there any final question? One final question here, this gentleman here, and then we'll have to wrap up.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Ken Chern with the Foreign Service Institute and Swinburne University. That last comment about choosing areas in the Pacific also struck me as a big bang for the buck possibility, since involvement in a place like Fiji may not bear the costs as it would be in a place like Thailand or Italy. That was one thing that struck me a moment ago. But I want to go back, if I could, to the issue of volatility that's been mentioned by several panelists, and Pat's comment in particular on 6 prime ministers in a decade compared to 30 years before, when there were 4 prime ministers over 32 years, 8 years per prime minister. And I wonder how much this has to do with reports, I think from the Lowy Institute, about declining interest in democracy as an important value, especially in the younger demographic in Australia, something which I think has been replicated in studies in the US as well, that younger demographics may be less sold on democracy as a value. And I wonder how much of a problem the panelists see that as in Australia, where it may come from, and how to attack it. Thank you.
Anyone want to take this question, Alan?
So, one of the things that you encounter in Australia not infrequently are debates in the education sector around civics education. And I think it goes to your point, Ken. How do you promote the value of democracy to a generation coming up? How do you sell the value of participation? I mean, I cannot tell you how many people I talk to when it comes to Saturday voting. Yeah, I went and voted. What's going to happen? Oh, I don't care. I mean, it is just such a commonplace reaction. You can get an opinion about what someone would prefer as an outcome, but the idea that politics is for the elite, politics is for somebody else, not for the average person, I think is a real problem here in the United States as well as Australia. Civics education hasn't not been done well in Australia for a long time. My wife tells a story. She was educated in Sydney. She tells a story about the civics education she had. She and I are the same age. So 1960s civics education. She knows an awful lot about the United States Congress. She never was taught the Australian parliamentary system in her civics education presentations. And it's been weak. It's improved over the years because it's been a point of debate, but I think it goes to your point.
Alan, can I ask you a follow-up? And I don't know if Jacob or anyone else on the panel knows, but is there any studies that have suggested, would there be a different result electorally in recent elections if voting was not compulsory, was not mandatory?
I've never seen anyone try to reverse engineer it. What would it look like if? compulsory voting is warmly embraced by the Australian populace. People like to say, well, if you don't vote, you get a fine, but the fine is immaterial. It's unimportant. It's absolutely unimportant. It is a norm in Australia.
Okay.
People will talk about it. Yeah, I don't want to get a fine. Come on, $20 and a court fee. I mean, your fine is worse if you don't vote in state elections than for the federal. And so, I think that I've never seen anyone do that. I've seen work on what's called voting appropriateness, I think is the right term, where do you vote the way that you believe, even though you have to vote? And people vote pretty much in line with their values. So,
Can I jump in on that?
Please.
I actually sort of dispute the argument that democracy is in decline in Australia, and in fact elsewhere as well, but I'll talk to Australia because I know it best. I mean, I think people are more engaged. If you look on social media, there's places for people to be engaged now. Facebook's incredibly important. There's interesting stories that's actually one of the reasons Morrison won. He engaged with people on Facebook. There was some innovative campaign techniques used where you got a robocall and you went through minutes later to an actual conversation with the Prime Minister. Now, he did 3 of those a night, apparently, from sitting on his bed in his hotel room. So, and that allowed him to really hit key parts of the electorate. The informal vote was down this election, which tells you people were engaged. I actually think the Senate's had a bit of a clean out. It's lost a lot of the crazies, quote unquote. Do we say this because perhaps some people don't like the outcome? Morrison's won, maybe progressives don't like that idea. But actually, I would say there was a genuine contest. Labor pitched to a younger generation. There were signs that they were mobilised. You had those big climate rallies where kids took time off from school. That upset a lot of older people who said kids should stay in school and do that on their weekends. But it's a sign that there's an engagement of some kind. So I take issue with that analysis. Yeah.
Question here. I'm sorry, by the way, I got my time wrong earlier. We have 20 minutes more, so we have plenty of time for questions and discussion.
Richard Southby, George Washington University and University of Melbourne. Mr. Turnbull was a very outspoken advocate for Australia becoming a republic. Has that disappeared with his disappearance?
Pat, do you want to take?
So we spoke of the big Labor picture. Again, obviously, without getting into the details of the republic, I personally support a republic and have done for a long time. But again, this is a meat and potatoes election in Australia, and I don't think anyone was sort of sitting there except a few perhaps in the inner suburbs of Sydney and Melbourne worrying about that issue. Labor did put it on the agenda, and again, I think it played into what people in the suburbs where elections are won kind of said, well, this is all an ethereal argument, it sounds wonderful, but I'm actually worried about mortgage prices, gas, petrol prices, and whether I can aspire to have my child go to a private school or not. So I don't foresee in the next few years, the Republic becoming an issue again. And I also think, the Queen, obviously she's getting to her twilight years, I think is fair to say. And I think there's a deep personal respect for her in the Australian community. I think that the Republic will come back once her reign comes to an end. That would be my view.
Any other questions? Here in the front row.
Unlike perhaps Europe and the United States, where somewhat unexpected results occurred, I haven't heard anybody mention that Russia interfered with the election in Australia.
Well, there's the greatest concern I think in Australia has been about Chinese interference. So was there anything to point out there?
To be honest, I didn't follow that part of the story. There was some talk of misinformation on WeChat. I don't know. I think one of the advantages of our system is that the opportunities for mischief are less because there is a single electoral commission that kind of sets the rules. So I feel like here in America, there's a lot more mischief happens at the state level.
But also just on that, the Turnbull government, to its absolute credit, putting the foreign interference laws went into place. Again, this was, something that a problem was identified. It was publicly, a conversation was had with the Australian people about matters that are uncomfortable, and the result was tightening up of the rules in which, it doesn't matter which foreign interference it is. It's about Australian democracy and.
Can I ask the question slightly differently, which is there any reason to think that Russia would have a strong preference in whether Labour or the Liberals won? I mean, we know that the Chinese had a preference, but does Russia have a strong preference? What's the state of Russia-Australia relations?
I don't think Mr. Putin is sitting around at 3 o'clock in the morning looking at the ceiling in the Kremlin worrying about what's happening in Canberra. I think that, certainly in my experience, it's in my sort of former official career, Russia was not something that looms very large. And obviously, going back to the days of the Tsar, there's always the standard line, isn't there, from the Russians, that we're going to become an Asiatic power as well. And we've seen that never comes to pass. But I don't think that's something that anyone in Canberra is sitting around particularly worrying about.
I mean, when we've seen cases of Russian interference, Russia seems to have a real playbook, not only in terms of the tools, the tactics, but also in terms of the objectives, which is very much about undermining the United States and its allies and partners and the Western alliances of NATO and the EU. And given the choice in this election, it doesn't seem that either alternative was in line to radically distance in the alliance or take positions that would be very different on those key things. There was a question of this gentleman in the back. Could you introduce yourself, please, and ask a question?
Certainly. Scott McDonald. I work with Smith's Gradings and Research. My question goes to, I think somebody in the panel mentioned that the first trip of Mr. Morrison would probably be Jakarta. We haven't talked about Indonesia at all. It sits just north of Australia. It's an economic power. It has concerns about U.S.-Chinese trade war. It has concerns about China's power. What is the impact of the election, if at any, in terms of Indonesian and Australian relations?
Do you want to take that?
I might take that. Thank you for your question, sir. I mean, the first thing is, Australia's top 4 trade partners are all in Northeast Asia. I don't think Indonesia is even in Australia's top 10 trade partners. That will change. That will change. I reckon it's been a solid 10 years, maybe more, that Australian planners in the sort of permanent national security bureaucracy have looked to Jakarta and looked to Indonesia with a wary eye. Going back to SBY, to Mr. Howard, Mr. Rudd, Ms. Gillard, Abbott, all the way through, they have worked assiduously at getting that relationship right. We're about to, in September this year, we'll go to the 20th anniversary of the East Timor crisis. So it is incredible that both sides in Jakarta and Canberra have worked very, very hard at getting the relationship right, back on track. And my generation, when we came into the system, Jakarta was something that we thought about, 15 odd years ago. Absolutely. But if I went and talked to a 25-year-old in the sort of foreign policy community in Canberra now about Indonesia, they would have no concept of how we used to think when I came into the system. And so the Australia-Indonesia relationship is one that is pretty rock solid, and I think absolutely as Indonesia's economy rises and its political influence not only through ASEAN but through the region rises, I think Australia and Indonesia relationship is something that's really on track. Alan or Zach's got it.
Well, the only comment I was going to ask you about was the reaction of in Indonesia to the announcement of moving the capital in Israel, and so is the Morrison government, how is that going to play out? Or is that a dead issue now for Indonesia? Or?
As far as I can read it, that was one of those flashpoint sort of button emotional issues, and I don't think there's a deep lingering effect particularly amongst the sort of Javanese elite in terms of, I don't think anyone would be willing to sacrifice strong relations with Australia on a, longer term basis on that issue, as much as that is an emotive issue.
Although the U.S. announcement of Trump's announcement that he was moving the embassy to Jerusalem, has really, I think, been a real sticking point in the relationship. And, many people will tell you that President Jokowi would not consider a meeting with Donald Trump until his recent election, because that was such a toxic issue. So it was unclear to me when Morrison made that announcement whether it was just kind of a stumbling out of the gate, sort of not thought through statement, and he's learned his lesson and he'll be more careful, or if he will continue down that track, which I think could pose some real problems in the bilateral relationship. I mean, that's a very sensitive issue in Jakarta. It created the largest protest ever in Jakarta against the U.S. position. So I think it does have the potential to derail.
I'd be very surprised if Morrison went there again.
You think it was just a stumble?
It was in the context of a by-election.
That's right.
For Malcolm Turnbull's old seat.
Right.
It was a tough by-election. The government lost it, perhaps even as a result of what was seen as a knee-jerk, unexpected thing that came kind of out of nowhere.
Yeah.
It's not like it's a debate in Australia.
Right.
And the backlash inside the coalition from the National Party was very strong, because they were losing customers in Indonesia, or made it difficult for the beef farmers and anyone else who's selling stuff to Indonesia. So they were very, very angry about that.
Yeah.
I'd be surprised if he tried that again.
Yeah. Okay. Very good. Any other questions? This gentleman here.
Richard Tier, retired Foreign Service. This is a story that Alan Tidwell has heard before. About 4 years ago, the then New Zealand ambassador Mike Moore asked what was wrong. When I asked him what was wrong with the Labour Party in New Zealand, he said, all you have to do is look at the surnames of the leaders in New Zealand and Australia. It was Andrew Little in New Zealand and Bill Shorten in Australia. That says it all. But the question that occurs to me is, what about stature in leadership? Where is the next Hawke or the next Howard or you name it going to come from on either side of politics?
Yeah, I was going to say either side. I mean, who are the next leaders for the Liberals as well, do you think? Jacob, do you have any thoughts?
Everyone wants to sort of have this return to Hawke Keating, or some people say Howard, but I mean, those sorts of characters are once in a generation.
Yeah.
The rest of the time you've got to do with what you got.
You get a Billy McMahon
and the other point is, those guys weren't great at the beginning either. Everyone thought Hawke was terrible in the initial year. So yeah, you got to give your leaders a go. I think that's part of the reason why Australians didn't vote for yet another Prime Minister, because I think probably some people actually want to see a Prime Minister last a bit longer to see if they develop into something like that.
Yeah.
Can I add in? I think there's a practical issue here, in my view. As we've gone through this insane 2-hour news, I mean, it's a 2-hour news cycle, right? There's when people talk about 24-hour news cycle, I find that amusing. But this generation, there's a hard line of generation, say people from their mid-40s up and then down. That is, those who understand how to manage the aggressive news cycle, how to not respond to it, how to not engage in, the echo chamber that is social media. So this kind of lost 10-year generation where the world changed on them instantly, and they didn't know how to respond to that because they're used to traditional campaigning methods. Those folks are now starting to step off the stage. Those who grew up, and I mean politically grew up, in the last decade with this aggressive news cycle and the social media, etc., they're now starting to step to the stage. So they're understanding how to, not manage it because you can never manage it, but when and where to respond to it and where to ignore it. And I think that's true across the Western world as well.
Amy, can I just
Yes,
ask a question of our Australian panelists?
Yeah.
So there's an assumption in the responses to this question that Morrison is not going to be a giant.
That's unfair, actually.
Okay, you think so?
Yeah. Give him time. He's only, the first 9 months he was the night watchman, as we say in cricketing terms, and now he's at the crease. So.
And he just put on 200 runs as the night watchman.
But we are at a moment in which Labor is going to be selecting a new leader, and so you wouldn't look at the next Labor leader to be the next, in your words, Dick, Bob Hawke, et cetera, et cetera. It's like it's going to probably be, help me.
Alba.
Thank you, Alba. Thank you. It was a senior moment. But Albanese is going to be the next Labor leader, but he's only there for a short period of time. I would think he'll lose the next election, and then we'll see what happens after that. That would be my take on it. And I do actually have a couple of people in my mind who I would see as replacements for Albanese and for Morrison. Morrison may in fact go and win 2 terms, I don't know. But I think Josh Frydenberg is someone who very much would like to be Prime Minister. He would like to pitch himself as being an iconic leader. Anytime you talk to him, he'll remind you of, he was from Menzies' old constituency, and okay, it must be in the groundwater or something. But and then the other one is Jim Chalmers from Queensland, and Chalmers has got a couple of things going for him. Chalmers is economically literate. He was the former chief of staff for Wayne Swan when Wayne Swan was treasurer. He's from Queensland. He's a smart guy. He's a centrist. He's able to, I think, navigate the vagaries of the Labour Party, and he would be someone I would look to in the future to rising to the top. But whether they mount the hill to be another Hawke or something like that, I don't know. But they would certainly be next in line.
Well, no one has mentioned Jacinda Ardern, who is the Prime Minister of New Zealand, but as I've read recently that she tops the Australian public opinion polls as their favorite politician. So maybe they could import her. So it's interesting. Okay, well, I think we're a little bit short on our time, but I think we've covered all the issues extraordinarily well. So please join me in thanking our panelists. Thank you.